Dr. Ari Whitten here. You know, if you're one of the millions of people out there that's suffering with chronic fatigue, or if you just don't have the energy to do the things that you love to do, then you're gonna love this week's session. Because I brought in one of the foremost experts on the subject, and we sat down to do a deep dive into the science of superhuman energy. Let's get into this. So I've got a very special guest for you all today. He's a best-selling author, creator of the Energy Blueprint program, host of the Energy Blueprint podcast, and an expert in all things energy related. He's also one of my favorite people in the whole world, my brother, Ari Whitten. Thanks for being here, man.
Thank you. That was a very formal introduction for us being brothers and best friends for pretty much our whole life, but thank you.
Well, not
Thank you, kind sir.
Yes, pleasure to be here. Nice to meet your acquaintance. Actually, yes. It is formal nowadays because not everybody knows that we used to live a stone's throw apart for years, and you've been hiding out in the jungles of Central America for what, a year and a half now. So you're a hard man to get a hold of.
Yes, well, not only were we living a stone's throw away from one another, we were roommates living in the same place for several years.
Yeah, that's called growing up together, sharing bunk
No, but after we left mom and dad's house, we were roommates for many years.
Yeah, we were roommates. We had bunk beds. You were about 4 years old. Remember that?
And yes, and when I had no money, I was living in your apartment, and yes, we have a long history together.
Your entire history, actually.
That's true. Almost your entire history, minus 5 years.
That's right. That's right. Well, I'm stoked to have you on. Yeah. You're actually not everybody knows that you're the reason that I have you on, that I have a show, and that you are now on the show.
Yes, I'm stoked that you have a show that I can be on.
Fantastic. Well, we're here to talk about something exciting that's happening tomorrow. Now, I'm fortunate because I got some advanced copies of this, and your brand new book, Eat for Energy, is going to be releasing tomorrow. First thing, I've actually, spoiler alert, I've sold through a couple cases in my clinic. Since I got the care package, and the feedback from it has been fantastic. So I'm excited to give my members a sneak preview of what they can expect in your brand new book.
Yeah, me too. Well, interestingly enough, you have a copy of my book, and I don't even have a copy of my book because I'm down here in Costa Rica where it's very difficult to get stuff.
I could send you mine, but it's all highlighted and got my notes in it. So I don't know if you're going to want that copy.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to seeing it in a few weeks. Everybody, you know, thousands of people are going to get the actual physical copy of the book before I do.
Oh, well, I can tell you, I just finished it, and I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. And I thought some of the concepts, which we're going to get into today, the way you present them takes this really complicated subject matter and makes it very easy to relate to, and I think intuitive.
Thank you. Well, you and I have, you know, I will say for everybody listening who may be only familiar with my big brother's work, but not mine, Yoni and I have been best friends since we were little, and not only best friends, but workout partners. And, you know, we've been studying health science and nutrition and fitness and physiology. I mean, since I was a little kid, since I was 12 or 13 years old. At that time, Yoni was a personal trainer, an aspiring bodybuilder, and really my mentor, my health science mentor. So I'm 38 now. That must make you 43. And, you know, that's however many years, that over 25 years that you and I have been talking shop as far as health science and physiology. And so this is really an ongoing, lifelong conversation at this point.
Yeah, that's a super good point. Is we've both been very fortunate to have each other as like a sounding board for all of our ideas and all of our theories. Where, oh, I was studying this. Well, what if we did this with it? And what if we tweaked it in this way? And then we also kind of experimented, with things, and, oh, what was your experience with this? And so, having that, you make a really good point there with having that was such a huge thing for me in advancing my knowledge. Most people are kind of stuck in a bubble where they don't get to relate those ideas. And we were doing it in real time, as we were studying and reading books, and we've shared ideas about, as we've gone the entire way. It's been pretty awesome. Yeah.
And I think one of the other critical aspects of that is it was always a practical thing for us. Mm-hmm. I think for many people, like I'm friends with, and I know a lot of functional medicine doctors that I interview on my podcast, and other people in the natural health space who are experts and who are great at what they do. But for them, it's something that they went to school for when they were in their 20s or 30s, and they learned about all these concepts, and then they started seeing patients. Mm-hmm. And it's different when you have 10 or 15 or 20 years in the trenches of actually experimenting with optimizing your own physiology, mm-hmm. where everything you're learning is about tweaking your own physiology on a very practical level. Yeah. So before we ever did, higher education, college and graduate school and all these kinds of things, we already had a decade plus of, experimentation with our physiology, learning about human physiology, but in this very practical frame of what's now called biohacking, but basically how do we optimize human physiology? And mm-hmm. I think that, doing it outside of the academic world first for a decade, mm-hmm. on this very practical level of how do I actually get better results in terms of, strength or muscle mass or fat loss or, or brain function or hormonal function or those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. It's a totally different kind of education than somebody who just goes to graduate school and just learns about these concepts academically.
That's a really good point. There's also one other thing that I think that strength training and bodybuilding, when you have a background and an understanding of the science of how that works, it really sets you up for a very clear understanding of input dictates output. Mm-hmm. In other words, understanding, tweaking my training volume, tweaking my exercises, tweaking my nutrition. Every single thing that I change will change the final product. Mm-hmm. And then it's just like you're saying, what's now called biohacking, which is actually a term that infuriates me, because you're not hacking anything. You're just giving this amazing body and mind input and then allowing it to do what it does. The closer you get to optimal input, the closer you'll get to optimal output. That's the hack. Try not to screw yourself up.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if you saw it yet. It just came out a few days ago, but I was interviewed on Dave Asprey's podcast.
Oh, I just got the notification. I haven't watched it yet.
Yeah. So he's considered the father of biohacking, quote unquote. Okay. He's really the father of biohacking in the sense that he coined the term biohacking, and he is a really smart businessman and marketer, and he was able to take the concept on a really big scale. Yes. But the truth is that bodybuilders were the original biohackers and have been doing it, since the 1970s, roughly, since the Arnold Schwarzenegger era, or maybe a bit earlier than him. And I had an interesting kind of back and forth with him on his podcast about hacking in the interview that he did of me, because I said some things that were kind of coming from the frame that you and I come from, and he's coming from the frame of more of a computer hacker. Yes. And, oh yeah, that's really slow and inefficient, and we can hack this process this way. And I actually made the point in the interview that that approach is actually, and I've never really heard somebody say this, but that approach is actually kind of a conventional medical approach in many ways. The conventional medical approach is like, if somebody has pain, for example, your area of expertise, let's not try to do all this fancy, complex stuff of physical assessment and figuring out what muscle imbalances and joint mobility issues maybe the underlying root cause of this. Let's just hack the pain. Here's a painkiller, right? Just take this painkiller. That's like the epitome of a hack.
That's exactly right.
But the problem with that approach is, number one, if you don't address root causes, you don't actually solve the problem. So you've still got the problem, and then you're just in a constant cycle of trying to, quote unquote, hack this thing by taking a painkiller to cover up, to basically block your brain's sensation of the pain, or maybe temporarily alleviate inflammation to alleviate the pain. But that's going to keep reappearing because you're not actually addressing the underlying root causes of it. So the framing of the whole biohacking thing is like, well, why do things in this inefficient way when you can just hack it? Well, the reason why is that you want to address underlying root causes so you actually solve the problem. So you don't just cover it up to which only creates a temporary benefit, symptomatic relief, while also creating side effects. Okay, now you've hacked your pain, but you've been doing that for several months, and now you've got leaky gut and gastrointestinal bleeding from all the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs you have. And now you've got another problem that you've got to go either solve or hack if you want to try that. And then if you try to hack that, maybe you cause another side effect that, so I would argue that while there are scenarios where a hack might be appropriate and where you might get a benefit without incurring a lot of negative side effects, in most contexts, if you try to hack things without addressing root causes, you're only going to get temporary benefits, symptomatic relief, while incurring lots of harm over time.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. And of course, we're talking about the extreme end of the biohack spectrum. But I believe that the reason why I have an issue with it is that there's an underlying lack of respect for the body and the mind. If you start off from the place that the body and the mind is an amazing thing that we don't fully understand, it's phenomenally complex, it's inherently intelligent and knows the right thing to do in every single situation. Barring, these very few genetic conditions. It's like 0.02%. So barring that, the body is remarkably intelligent and knows exactly what to do in any given situation. Oh, you're in a super hot environment, your body will begin to sweat and send blood to your superficial tissue so that it interacts with the outside temperature and then goes back and cools you. Basically how a radiator works. Right? Oh, you're in a super cold environment. I'm going to pull your blood away from your extremities, and I'll be willing to even sacrifice your nose and your fingers and your toes to keep your most essential organs alive, because it's amazingly intelligent. Oh, you go to altitude, I'll make more red blood cells so that you can carry more oxygen. It's amazing. We could never hope to create a mechanism that was that intelligent, that could change on a dime just like that. I had a conversation with Dr. Stuart McGill, who's, the most well-regarded back pain expert in the world. And he was hired by a television show. I think it was on Discovery Channel. And the premise of the show was, we're going to talk to a knee expert and a back expert and a shoulder expert. And we want all of these engineers and experts to create a better structure than Mother Nature, God, whatever you prefer, created. And the end result, he said, was that the show never aired because none of these experts could come up with a design that was better than what we already have.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we're at. And what I love about your new book is that what you just said reads through the entire approach that you take in this book. It is not a biohacking book. It is a book on how to optimize your physiology. I want to pause for just a second to let you know that my brother and I do get pretty deep into the science of energy creation in this interview. And if you're more interested in the practical side of things and knowing what you can expect in my brother's new book, Eat for Energy, then you can click the link here for a short presentation where he goes through practical strategies that you can begin implementing immediately.
The fundamental frame, the real difference is a paradigm of we think we know better than the body. the body's dumb, we're going to fix the body's mistakes, or coming from a frame of working to understand the way that the body works, the innate intelligence of the body, having respect and appreciation for the innate intelligence of the body. And then once you understand how those things work from that frame, how do we optimize it? And one of those two frames is an approach like I was describing before. Oh, you're in pain, must be for random reasons. Let's give you a painkiller. Or the other side of that is the work that you do, right? And you're in pain, let's figure out what's causing that and fix the root causes, right? And that's the same work that I do when it comes to energy. Yes. You know, if you have chronic fatigue and you go to a conventional doctor, which is a huge portion of the visits to general practitioners, it's like over 50%. It's because primarily of the symptom of fatigue. Wow. People are like, I'm tired. I've got no energy. What's going on? Mm-hmm. And there's some really interesting data on this from a paper called Fatigue and Overview. And it was something published several years ago that's basically a compilation of the scientific literature and what they're calling, quote unquote, evidence-based guidelines for how physicians should treat their patients with chronic fatigue. Okay. And there's a few interesting things from this paper. The first thing is all these patients are going to these conventional doctors thinking, well, I've got no energy. You know, let's go see what the best of modern science, modern medicine has to offer. They have got all these amazing technologies and tools and blood analysis and hormone analysis. They're just going to take some tests and figure out what's going on in my physiology. Mm-hmm. Well, they say in this paper, anybody wants to look it up, again, it's called Fatigue and Overview, and it's published in the American Journal of Family Physicians.
I'll link to it in the show notes down below.
Yeah. So they say in this paper, only in 5% of cases, 5 out of every 100 people that come to a doctor complaining of fatigue, only in 5% do they actually find anything on their lab testing that can be an explanatory factor in the person's fatigue. Whoa. 5 out of 100 people with chronic fatigue.
So how can you justify spending the money and the time and the resources to run those kind of tests if those are the results that they're getting?
Okay, so well, let me take it a step further. Okay, so that's the first thing. So first of all, this idea that you're going to go to your doctor and they're going to run tests and figure out, you know, your unique causes of fatigue is nonsense. You got a 95% chance of learning nothing from those tests, and them telling you your test results look normal, that everything's within normal ranges. We don't know what's causing your fatigue. In the 5% of cases, it's usually things like anemia, or they figure out you've got hypothyroidism, or you've got diabetes or something like that. So the other thing they said is there are 4 treatments that they have for people with fatigue. The first one is antidepressants. The second one is a recommendation to do 30 minutes of walking per day. The third one is cognitive behavioral therapy. And the fourth one is stimulants as needed. Okay. Now, keep in mind, just, you know, this is what they're saying. This is the best of modern science, evidence-based guidelines. Let me point something out. They didn't even mention nutrition. Yeah. It's not even mentioned in the entire paper. Like these physicians are not even being trained they can have a patient show up with chronic fatigue and it won't even cross their mind to ask the patient whether they're eating McDonald's and Doritos and ice cream and pizza all day. Wow. It won't even cross their mind to think of that or analyze that as a potential cause of their energy issues.
Yeah, well, it's not in their training, and so it's not in their thought process that is a form of treatment.
Right. And you know, it's hard to fully do justice to the absurdity of the fact that so much of the general population looks at those people and says, oh, they're MDs. They must know everything about everything. Mm-hmm. You know, they're the ones who really understand health. And it's like they don't take a single nutrition class. And their evidence-based guidelines for treating chronic fatigue, which is one of the most common epidemic issues in our society right now, hasn't even integrated the entire field of nutrition science of tens of thousands of studies. It's not even mentioned in their evidence-based guidelines. Wow. Circadian rhythm and sleep issues are not even mentioned in these evidence-based guidelines. And those are the two most common causes of chronic low energy levels. And there are several other common causes that we have lots and lots of evidence for that aren't even mentioned in their guidelines. So, again, it's hard to fully, in words, encapsulate how insane it is that we live in this world where that issue is so common, and the people that are being looked to as the experts in it have almost nothing to offer.
Well, that's something that I relate to on a very deep level. I didn't know going into my profession that what I would be dealing with on a day-to-day basis would be such fundamental lifestyle issues. I didn't think that would be the bulk of my work, but that's what it's ended up being for 16 years now, is just coaching people on fundamental lifestyle issues and the basics that they need to do to care for themselves. It would be like the equivalent of a dentist spending most of their time teaching people how to brush and floss.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, over 80% of the chronic disease burden in the US and in the West in general are diseases of civilization, diseases of nutrition and lifestyle. And yet we are kind of living in a paradigm where, we're brought up as people who were raised in the United States, we're brought up in a place where we see direct-to-consumer advertising, one of two countries in the world where we see direct-to-consumer advertising of from pharmaceutical companies. So we're brought up in this paradigm where we're taught to, from a very early age, we're kind of indoctrinated with this paradigm that every disease that you might incur, modern medicine is working to, quote unquote, find a cure. And the cure is inevitably some particular chemical, some pharmaceutical compound with that's derived from the paradigm of, each disease is caused by some unique biochemical abnormality, and we need to find the drug, find the cure, quote unquote, that interrupts that aberrant biochemical pathway and then fixes it and cures the disease.
Yeah, and the one of the insidious things about that is that the solutions are always outside of self.
Yes. Well, of course, because it's more profitable that way.
Yeah, but it's also immensely disempowering.
Yeah. It's immense. That's the side effect of the financial incentive, the way that the market is structured as far as how medicine is conducted. The whole field of medicine has shifted to a focus that aligns with profit motives, instead of aligning with like the question and a philosophy of what actually is the best way to make people healthy and to cure disease.
Yeah,
that's not what it's aligned with. It's aligned with what is the best way to make money off of trying to help people cure diseases or find symptomatic relief from their medical conditions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and if you, not to go too deep in this, but if you understand the business framing of that, it's obviously in your best interest that the sicker someone is, the more drugs they're on, the more money you stand to make. And I've been in a hospital, I've been in internal medicine ward settings, and I've seen so many people who are in there with all kinds of medical conditions who are on 10, 12, 15, 18, 20 different prescription drugs at the same time. I mean, that's what old age looks like for most people in the West. That's what this paradigm leads to. If you want to have many different diseases and be on a drug for each of the different diseases and symptoms you have, you can operate in that paradigm. Or you can operate in a paradigm that respects the innate intelligence of your body and seeks to optimize it and maximize your health span so you live well into old age without needing to be on drugs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is the normal human condition as it's been for the vast majority of our species' existence on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that fatigue-related conditions are responsible for 50% of doctors' visits. That's here in the United States.
Yeah.
And they're not even asking these people about their nutritional status, how they're eating, what they're eating, when they're eating, and they're not even asking them about sleep.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And sleep conditions are a major problem in this country. Like the incidence of insomnia is through the roof.
Yeah, I mean, and unless you're lucky enough to actually see somebody who knows the literature on that topic, who is a chronic fatigue specialist, then and maybe you're lucky enough to see somebody who's a functional medicine doctor who has some they've sought out training outside of their formal medical education to learn about nutrition, to learn about all the research on sleep and circadian rhythm issues that are linked with chronic fatigue syndrome, for example. Then most likely you will learn nothing about nutrition or sleep or circadian rhythm. But yeah, those things are definitely massive contributors to the epidemic of chronic low energy levels that we're seeing in the world right now.
What are the causal factors that we should be looking at if we're 95% inaccurate with this lab testing that we're doing? What should we be asking these people that are suffering with chronic fatigue?
Yeah, well, it's fine to get lab testing. It's always, there's nothing wrong with ruling out some more serious condition as a causal factor.
Yeah.
And if you want to do that as a starting point, I think that's perfectly fine. If you and then maybe it identifies, oh, you've got iron deficiency anemia, or you've got diabetes, or you've got hypothyroidism, and if that's a full-blown thing, then you can potentially take some action to address that.
So I fully agree with what you're saying. However, as a clinician, how I typically work in the office is I'm going for Vegas odds. What are the most likely contributing factors to this person's problem? And then I'll work from the most likely to the least likely, unless there's something glaring that's pointing at those other things. So what are the most likely factors that we're going to see in the vast majority of fatigue sufferers?
Yeah. And in the work that you do, working with people who, I've got this my shoulder won't move, or my hip's in chronic pain, right? You can't do a blood test or a hormone panel and figure out what's causing that, right? That's a different set of skills that you have to build to do that kind of physical assessment. To essentially, like, what you're doing is you're visualizing in your head, based on the physical assessments you're doing, what is going on in that person's body. And that's, like, you are the assessment tool, and it's a way more sophisticated assessment tool than a blood test would be for that scenario.
In my case, we have some conditions that there's some blood testing for, but imaging is kind of the end all be all.
Right. But even with imaging, there's a lot of stuff that you won't be able to see on that for a lot of
certainly depends on the quality of the machine that you're using in a massive way.
Right. Yeah. So with fatigue, with energy issues, we have similar levels of kind of it being a black box, in the sense that we don't have great machines to just tell you, oh, your energy issues are from this or that. We have to analyze. First of all, we have to understand that chronic low energy issues are almost always going to be from the lifestyle, nutrition, environmental level. So we need to figure out what's going on at those levels to address that and fix the root causes and optimize the body for producing energy. Now, there's a couple different scenarios or contexts. One scenario would be, let's say someone is taking pretty decent care of themselves. They've read lots of nutrition books, and they exercise regularly. They eat a good diet. They're sleeping. They know how to optimize their sleep. They're a health conscious person who's taken good care of themselves for years, and all of the sudden their energy just went down the tank. Like, I mean, just crashed, and they've been fatigued for 3 months, and there's no clear explanation for that, right? In that kind of context, this is where you might want to strongly suspect, oh, maybe they have water damage in their house and they've been exposed to mold or something like that. Maybe it's some kind of extreme stressor. Maybe they're, going through horrible relationship stress with their spouse and they're going to get a divorce or something like that. Or maybe they got a severe infection and now they're suffering, some post, what you could call basically long-lasting symptoms after infection, which not only happens with COVID, but this is a thing that happens with many other things, many other infections, Epstein-Barr virus and cytomegalovirus and other viruses. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that happens, like in a person, and you might want to, in that context, basically do the detective work and see if you can figure out what's the specific thing that is the cause, quote unquote, of this person's energy issues. Most people are not in that context though. And that context I would liken to like a car mechanic who is, you've got somebody brings in their car is not working or it's making a weird sound. The car mechanic does their diagnostic work. They plug in their machine. They go through this or that process and they figure out, oh, it's the catalytic converter or whatever. It's you're low on oil, right? And they'll find the one specific thing and then we fix that, we replace that part, we add oil, whatever it is. However, it's a different context to think of, like, let's imagine the difference between a car mechanic that's repairing a Geo Metro or something like that, or a Ford Taurus or something, in that way I just described, versus someone who's an expert in building Ferraris, right? How do I engineer the fastest, most amazing car in the world? Right? Those are different sets of knowledge and different skill sets. So what I argue with the human body is that what most people need to be doing is learning the skills of how to build their body into a Ferrari. And instead of how do I do the detective work to figure out the one thing that I'm then going to, take a pill for to try to fix that one problem that I'm having, right? Again, there's a context for that. Sometimes that happens. But for most people, what's going on is actually that their body, their physiology and their cellular health and their mitochondrial health, the health of their cellular energy generators has been deteriorating over years and years and years and decades. And the goal is less to identify some one thing that then you're going to fix by replacing that part or changing the oil or whatever, and much more into how do I engineer my body? How do I build my body into the best machine that it can possibly be? And fatigue issues are a function of the body deteriorating. So how do we build everything up to function at a higher and higher level? Everything in our physiology is connected. Every system of the body is connected. And the more you understand about physiology, the more that you understand this. There is a gut-brain connection. By virtue of that, what's going on in our gut massively impacts what's going on in our brain. There's a gut immune connection. There's a gut mitochondria connection. There's a gut lung connection, right? And that's just gut, right? There's a gut skin connection. There's a mitochondria brain connection. What's going on in the brain affects what's going on in your mitochondria within seconds. And what's going on in your mitochondria, as we can talk about, affects everything. Mitochondria are pretty much the most upstream regulator of almost everything that's going on in our metabolism throughout our body, including regulating hormones, neurotransmitters. So what's going on in our circadian rhythm and our sleep impacts hormones, impacts neurotransmitters, impacts gut health, impacts insulin resistance or insulin sensitivity and blood sugar regulation, which in turn, all those hormones and neurotransmitters and blood sugar issues impact on everything else. Our body composition, how fat and how muscular we are, has a huge impact on our brain function, on our muscle function, on how much inflammation we have in our system. How much inflammation we have in our system in turn impacts on mitochondrial function, immune function, brain function. Everything is interconnected. So there isn't really, we cannot look at physiology like we look at a car, where it's like, oh, your muffler's broken, so you just fix your muffler, boom, you're off, right? Human physiology, when you've got a symptom like fatigue, you can pretty much be guaranteed that lots of stuff is broken or lots of stuff is not functioning optimally in your body. So the goal is, because everything's connected in your body, everything either works in downward spirals of worse and worse function, where, you know, your gut starts to dysfunction, so your brain starts to dysfunction, so your hormones are dysfunctioning, so you've got chronic inflammation, so you've got immune problems, so you've got mitochondrial problems, so you've got sleep problems. We need to turn those downward spirals of worse and worse physiology into upward spirals, positive upward spirals of improved functioning of all those systems. And the way that you do that is by creating positive inputs in these different levers. You pull on the different levers of human physiology to, let's say, optimize your sleep and your circadian rhythm. Oh, well, it turns out, since that affects so many neurotransmitters and hormones and, you know, blood sugar issues, now you're creating massive amounts of positive inputs on every system of the body, and literally the ability of your cells to regenerate every night while you sleep, which affects everything in a positive way. You start putting in good nutrition, so you're giving your cells the nutrients they need to do their processes, to create hormones, for mitochondria to create energy. Everything is going to work better. Mitochondria produce virtually all of the energy that virtually all of the trillions of cells of our body rely on, from our brain to our heart to our liver to our intestines to our muscles. Virtually everything depend on mitochondria. So if you can pull that lever, optimize your mitochondria to make them produce more energy, everything works better. Your brain, your heart, your hormone producing glands, your muscles, everything works better. So and there's many more levers that we can talk about, and I'm sure we'll get into, but that's the idea, is we're trying to build the body into the best machine possible, and the way we do that is by pulling on different levers that allow us to create positive inputs that create these positive upward spirals of physiology that optimize everything. And as a result of that, a natural result of optimizing those things is that you will have more energy. And as a side effect, you're going to live a lot longer, and you're going to help prevent dozens of different diseases.
Well, that seems like a pretty good deal. I think that's actually one of the most exciting things about it, is the upward spirals that you're talking about. Because all the systems are interconnected, when you start positively influencing any one of them, by virtue of those connections, you positively influence all of them. And that's the most exciting thing, because as you begin making these little tweaks to your lifestyle and changing the inputs and altering the output, you're affecting everything. So small changes can have big consequences, especially when you do them consistently over time. And that, I think, is the most exciting thing, is when people make that first change and they start to realize how, oh my God, I'm sleeping better. Oh my God, my digestion is better. I'm not having the cramping or the pain or the gas or whatever I was having forever. Like those little changes, they amplify over time. I think of it like almost like compound interest, you know, just adding up. Now, you were talking about mitochondria a little bit, and that's one of the things that I love in your book is the way that you present mitochondria. And one of the things that I found fascinating in your presentation was the dual function of mitochondria. So everybody talks about mitochondria going all the way back to basic physiology 101, is they're the powerhouse of the cell. They're responsible for energy production. But their second function is directly tied to the fatigue issue, which we've been talking about, which is cellular defense.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the amazing thing that you present in this book, which I had never heard before in the way that you say it, is that those dual functions are mutually exclusive.
That's
Can
right.
you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Okay. So you set it up very nicely. You did a lot of my work for me here. So mitochondria are our energy producers. As I said, they're producing virtually all of the energy that virtually all of the trillions of cells in our body are relying on to do their role, whatever their role is. Your heart cells do a different role than your brain cells, which do a different role than your gut cells and your muscle cells and your hormone producing glands. They all depend on the energy produced by mitochondria, and they all function more poorly when mitochondria are not producing enough energy.
Mm-hmm.
So mitochondria as these energy producers, that's one thing. As you said, that's what we all learn about mitochondria in high school and college biology. Mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. They're our energy generators. But they also, what's been discovered in the last decade or so, but mainly thanks to the work of a brilliant researcher named Dr. Robert Naviaux, who coined the term the cell danger response. This is a scientist who runs a lab for mitochondrial medicine at the University of California, San Diego. And he's done a lot of incredible work in chronic fatigue and autism and just the mitochondria more broadly. And he has basically figured out through his research that mitochondria have this other role that really nobody was aware of for decades, for a century since mitochondria were discovered, that in cellular defense. And basically what this means is that mitochondria, in addition to being energy generators, are actually environmental sensors. And they are essentially constantly asking the question, is it safe to produce energy? Okay, so not only are they're not just these mindless energy generators that like we're taught in high school and college biology courses that just take in carbs and fats and pump out energy in the form of ATP. They're environmental sensors, and they're basically canaries in the coal mine that are constantly taking samples of their environment and going, is it safe to produce energy? Is it safe to produce energy? And they're picking up on the presence of danger signals, of threats, of stressors that might be present in the body. And in response to those signals that they're picking up from those threats, they turn down the dial on energy production and shift resources towards cellular defense. So if you let's say you were living in some inner city neighborhood in the Ukraine right now, and the Russians started attacking. They put poison gas in the streets. It would be a really bad mistake to carry out your usual normal routines as you would normally do in the absence of that, like to just leave the windows open and say, oh, let's let the breeze in. It's a nice day outside. Let's go for a walk, in the park. Let's go for a walk down the street with the dog, right? What you do when you're under attack is you seal yourself in your house. You do not go outside. You do not do your normal energy, requiring routines. You're sealing yourself off and protecting yourself. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what mitochondria do when they're under attack. Mm-hmm. And their job is to do that. Their job is not only to shield themselves, but actually they're as sort of the central hub of the wheel of metabolism. Those are the words of Dr. Robert Naviaux. Mm-hmm. They are the most upstream thing that is actually coordinating the whole body's metabolic response to that threat. Mm-hmm. And so they are helping to shield the whole body off from that threat and then direct energy and resources towards fending off the threat. So the key point is that basically what we can extend or sort of extrapolate out of this paradigm is that our physical energy levels are a reflection of the degree to which our mitochondria are under attack, the degree to which they are picking up on the presence of threats and turning down the dial on energy production and shifting resources towards cellular defense. If you've got your body's not under attack from various stresses, if you've optimized everything in your lifestyle and environment and nutrition, your body's going to perceive that it's in a safe place, and it's in what Dr. Robert Naviaux calls peacetime metabolism, and what I call energy mode, which is mitochondria are directing their focus towards producing abundant energy. If, on the other hand, the mitochondria are sensing that they're under attack, they turn that down and they shift resources towards cellular defense. So that's fundamentally what is actually regulating our energy levels. There are many dozens of different physiological mechanisms of things that in one way or another will impact upon our energy, many different hormones and neurotransmitters and dozens, hundreds of biochemical processes that in one way or another relate to energy levels. But what's fundamentally controlling them and regulating them is our mitochondria responding to the degree of threat that they're under.
Yeah. So another way of putting that is that your degree of fatigue will directly reflect the degree of toxicity in your environment or your lifestyle input.
Exactly.
And so if you're knocking it out of the park with energy, you can reasonably assume that you're doing pretty darn good in terms of your environment and lifestyle. And
That's right.
if you're not, then you should be taking a very close look at your environment and your lifestyle.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah. So you asked me earlier, what are the things people should be looking towards? And I gave kind of a long, complicated answer to that. But fundamentally, now that we understand this mitochondrial frame, basically the goal is essentially twofold. Okay. And I'll add one layer that I haven't talked about yet. The first thing that you're trying to do is minimize the amount of stress and threats that your mitochondria are sensing. So first of all, we got to understand what are those things that the mitochondria are sensing. Well, fundamentally, they can sense almost every type of stressor imaginable, from poor nutrition and nutrient insufficiency to environmental toxins, to light deficiencies and toxicities, to poor gut health, to blood sugar issues, to sleep deprivation, to psychological stress. They can sense everything. And the way that they sense it is because almost every type of stressor is ultimately reduced down to either higher levels of inflammatory cytokines or oxidative stress or cellular damage. Almost everything gets fundamentally reduced down into one of those different mechanisms, and mitochondria sense oxidative stress, inflammation, cell damage. And in response to that, they're turning down the dial on energy production. So factor number one is, what are those things that the mitochondria are sensing and turning down the dial on energy production in response to? The second thing is this. In your work, I'm sure you've dealt with a lot of bone breaks and people who have had fractures. They've had a cast on their arm or their leg or whatever for 6 or 8 weeks. What do you notice if you see them right after they get their cast off? What do you notice when you compare one leg or one arm to the other one?
There's atrophy and rigidity.
Yeah, it's half the size of the other one. And you know me, I broke a lot of bones when I was little. So I got to see this multiple times. But the point is that literally within a matter of weeks, the muscle cells atrophied. Those muscle fibers shrank to a huge degree.
Yeah.
And that's because the body is ruthless in getting rid of tissue that is energetically costly, that is not needed for survival.
Yes. I always talk about the prime driver of the body is survival. And the word ruthless is perfect for this, because if you are not using something, the body will get rid of it, because it's like, I am not wasting resources that are going to be necessary for my survival on something that's not being used. Right.
This is a bit of a digression, but there's an amazing book, one of the most amazing books I've ever read. It's called The 7 Mysteries of Life. And it's not talked about. It doesn't get the respect it deserves as, I think, one of the most incredible books of all time. It took the guy something like 20 or 30 years to write this book. He did all the illustrations for it, but it's basically like this tour de force of life and the world and the universe. And one of the most amazing sections that I remember reading in that book was about mitochondria and and it was comparing certain animal species with different amounts of mitochondria in them. And I remember it talked about hummingbirds. Mm-hmm. Hummingbirds have this absolutely insane amount of mitochondria in their cells, and they're just packed to the brim of them to fuel this, like, whatever it is, I don't know the exact number, but 40, 60 flaps of their wings per second or something like that. And they have so much mitochondria that they actually have to, when they sleep at night, well, two things. So they have to feed themselves almost constantly. They have to be pouring sugar into that system, pouring fuel into that system to keep that furnace going. And then at night, in order to just survive the nighttime period of several hours without consuming food, they have to go into this crazy state, almost like this hibernation state, where they slow down their physiology dramatically, and they turn down their body temperature massively, and they go into this state it's much deeper than sleep. It's like almost the body turning off completely. Mm-hmm. And they have to do that just to survive 6 or 8 hours without consuming food, because their body burns through so much fuel that they'd literally starve to death if they kept that furnace going. Amazing. So those mitochondria are actually, from a survival perspective, this a massive liability. Yeah. So humans, the human species, has a certain number of mitochondria that we've been programmed with that is optimized not for having the energy of a hummingbird, but optimized for survival given the kinds of food availability we have in our environment. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't, if you have too little, then you've got no energy and you can't move around your environment. Sure. and survive.
Anybody who's fasted for any extended period of time knows exactly what you're talking about.
Right. And if you've got too much, now you've got to feed yourself constantly, and your whole life needs to be about feeding yourself every 5 minutes. Otherwise, you can't survive. So there's an optimal level of mitochondria. So all of this is to loop back to the sort of muscle atrophy with disuse. Basically, our mitochondria are challenged by certain kinds of things. They're stimulated by certain kinds of things. Hormetic stress in particular, things like exercise, things like cold exposure and heat exposure, things like fasting, things like certain phytochemicals, breath holding practices. And in the absence of those challenges, of that stimulation to your mitochondria, the body basically goes, oh, we don't need those energetically costly things. They're obviously not necessary for our survival in the environment that we're in. So let's get rid of them. And the exact process of muscle atrophy that happens when you have a cast, when you're not stimulating and challenging those muscle fibers, is exactly the same thing that happens internally in your cells at the mitochondrial level when you are not challenging your mitochondria. So basically, all of this is to say that it's been shown in studies, they actually muscle biopsy studies, where they take people of different ages, 20-year-old, 30-year-old, 40-year-old, 70-year-old, and they jam, as you know, what a muscle biopsy needle looks like. It's no fun. It's a big hollow needle. They take a big chunk of muscle tissue out, and they physically count the number of mitochondria and the total mitochondrial mass in those cells. And what they've shown is that people lose about 10% of their mitochondrial capacity with each decade of life. Okay. Such that most 70-year-olds have about only 25% of the mitochondrial capacity of a young person.
Wow.
Okay. Now, people listening might think, well, that really sucks that, aging does that to us and we lose so much of our cellular energy generators. Well, here's the cool thing. If you look at 70-year-olds who are lifelong athletes, exercisers, they have the same mitochondrial capacity as a young adult.
Wow.
So what that means is that this loss of mitochondrial capacity is not just a normal function of aging. Sure. It is actually a function of lack of hormetic stress in our lifestyle. So to loop things back, again, the two factors that are controlling human energy levels, fundamentally are: one, the extent to which your mitochondria are under attack, under threat, under stress, and they're turning down the dial on energy production. And the second thing is, how many mitochondria do you have? Do you have youthful levels of mitochondria, that big, healthy, strong mitochondria and cells that are filled with them? Or do you have cells with weak, degenerated, atrophied mitochondria that are dysfunctional and damaged, and very few mitochondria in total because they've all, gone away? The body got rid of them because it felt like they weren't needed. And those two fundamental dynamics are what are controlling human energy levels. So those are the things we have to optimize if we want more energy.
Yeah, it was fascinating. Chapter one already blew my mind. And you frame fatigue as this survival mechanism. And it's almost like in the hospital, if somebody's recovering some incredibly traumatic event, like a brain injury or something, medical doctors will induce a coma so that the body can direct all of its healing resources towards the tissue that needs to be repaired. They found that that's the most efficient way. I actually heard a story about soldiers injured in combat, where both eyes were damaged, and it was dictated, or rather it was determined, that one eye had the potential to survive much more so than the other. They actually found, and this is fascinating and it ties directly into what you're saying, is that by removing the other eye, you have a better chance of saving the one eye with less damage.
Wow, that's
and it
crazy.
goes right back to what you're saying. But it wouldn't have occurred to me that removing the eye was necessary, but they basically say, like, we're going to force the body to shuttle all resources to the one that can be saved, rather than going 50-50 to one that has a worse chance than the other. Isn't that amazing? I found that absolutely fascinating. So this fatigue situation is actually a coma of sorts. The body's like, I'm going to hold on, and I'm going to put myself into this state that is way less optimal. And I know that it sucks, but I'm hoping that the person will consciously recognize that this environment is not appropriate, and I'm just going to hold on until they can get me into a better environment.
Yeah. What do bears and many other mammals do if they're going through a really harsh winter for 4 or 6 months of the year or something like that?
Shut the engines down.
They hibernate. Exactly. Yeah. And there are many other lower species of animals, worms, that go into a state called dower, which is basically like a hibernation mode, but it's specifically, and many other things like tardigrades, these little water bears, microscopic water bears that are ubiquitous everywhere in the world. Another thing I learned in that book many years ago, 7 Mysteries of Life. These little microscopic, they look like bears, but they have 6 legs, and they're microscopic, and they live in water. They're even in raindrops. There's little creatures in raindrops. And these tardigrades and many other animals like this, when they're exposed to a harsh environment, to toxic conditions, they go into basically a state of dormancy, where they are in this almost inanimate state. They're not dead, but they're not really alive. And they can survive unbelievably harsh conditions, like crazy extremes of temperature and pressure and toxins and all kinds of things, by turning down the engines. And then as soon as the creature senses that conditions are safe, and as soon as the bear senses temperatures are warming up a bit, then the engines turn back on, right? And then they become more alive. Yeah. And it's kind of actually amazing that we humans haven't really integrated that kind of understanding into our own physiology, but that's essentially what chronic fatigue is. It's a survival mechanism that is adaptive, that is helpful in the context of surviving a stressful environment.
Well, that's super interesting, and it really ties into what I teach about pain, as how it's this critical message that's tied to a survival mechanism. The body's like, hey, I'm letting you know that what we're doing right now is harmful to the ultimate goal, which is long-term survivability. And this signal is supposed to jolt you into changing. And I almost think of how you explain fatigue as the exact same thing, but the signal only registers when it gets loud enough for the person to hear it, when it becomes enough of a difference between the signal and your daily state. But if you're just in chronic fatigue all the time, then that's your normal. So you don't even recognize the signal. You're like, you're not speaking the body's language.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, there's an interesting thing with an interesting difficulty with the subjective improvements that happen. This is true also of something even like fat loss or muscle gain. When things happen slowly over time, it's hard to see improvement. It's hard to actually notice it. And then maybe you have lost fat and you don't even notice that you've lost fat, but you see somebody you haven't seen in 6 months and they're like, wow, you look great. You look like you've lost a lot of weight, right? Same is true, as you and I know from many years of trying to build muscle, that it's a very slow process. But yeah, that reference for comparison is important because, if you don't even know what having high energy feels like anymore, because it's been so long since you were a kid with youthful energy, you've forgotten how that feels. You've normalized low energy. Plus the society around us has also normalized low energy. And there's also I would say a toxic element of our culture that actually almost wears fatigue like a badge of honor. Yeah. We use it to virtue signal to others how busy we are and how important we are. Oh, I've just been slammed at work and, I just haven't had time to sleep and I'm just crazy busy right now. And, I'm so tired because I'm not even sleeping right now. That's how busy I am. Right. And we live in a culture where that's something that boosts our status, our social status, for others to perceive us as being so important and so in demand and so busy that we don't even have time to sleep and we don't have time to take care of our energy levels. But this is, to be blunt, it's very stupid. It's very counterproductive, because if you're in that mode for very long, you're not going to last very long.
Yeah. You're 100% right on that. And one of the things that I think gets a lot of people into trouble is the comparison of what we use as a reference standard for normal here in the United States. So, for example, stimulant consumption is considered normal. Depressant consumption is considered normal. We've got over 70% of our population that's overweight or obese. We've got dietary problems. Vast majority of the population doesn't hit basic standards for physical activity. So those are our normals in this society. And so trying to convince people to change lifestyle, they think that it's radical to ask somebody to walk 5 to 9 miles a week, whereas we've got research showing that throughout the majority of human existence, that was the norm. It's only in the last 100 years or so that we've really taken a sharp deviation from that, and much more so in the last 30 years.
Yeah.
And so it's difficult to make those kinds of things. And going full circle to what we were talking about in the beginning, that's one of the reasons why these biohacks are so popular, is because the results happen quickly. So what are some of the signs that, besides low energy levels, that a person has these types of toxic environmental exposures or an insufficient lifestyle? What are some of the most common things? Like you talk about in the book that chronic fatigue often manifests or causes problems with the blood-brain barrier. One of the things that I found fascinating that I did not know about is that the people with chronic fatigue can't fully contract their muscles. They had something like a 60% reduction in their ability to contract their muscles. And the study that you quoted was amazing, because they showed in that study that when they did direct electrical stimulation, the muscle was able to fully contract. It was only when the person was controlling it from their own brain that it was a 60% reduction. So can you speak to some of that and the relationship to mood disturbances and cognitive decline and brain fog and things like that tons of people are suffering with nowadays?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you mentioned some of them. So there are a number of symptoms that commonly overlap with chronic low energy levels. Many different brain symptoms, anxiety, depression, brain fog, all strongly overlap with chronic fatigue, chronic low energy levels. Brain-related fatigue is another one. So this is basically where if somebody engages in a mentally demanding task, let's say a conversation like this, where they're being challenged to speak on, you know, scientific topics, or they're writing, or they're typing emails, or they're even just driving a car or reading a book or something like that. After 15 minutes or half an hour, an hour of that activity, they might really crash and their brain function kind of shuts down. That's brain-related fatigue. You might also have a leaky blood-brain barrier. That's pretty common in people with especially severe chronic fatigue. And this can cause symptoms of either slow brain function or sometimes rapidity of certain brain functions, or excessive firing of certain neurons, particularly like glutamate toxicity, which can result in racing thoughts and anxiety and those kinds of symptoms, difficulty sleeping. So there are a number of symptoms. I would say anxiety, depression, brain fog probably are the most common things that overlap. Yeah, well, there's lots of other ones that we could potentially talk about, but those are probably the big ones. And one of the other mechanisms that regulates fatigue, one of the other important mechanisms, other than mitochondria, it's overlapping with mitochondria, kind of turning down the dial on energy production in response to stressors. But we actually have some brain-related mechanisms as well. And one of them is called sickness behavior. This is actually a term in the scientific literature. You can look this up. There's lots of studies on it. And basically, the brain responds to certain regions in the brain respond to high levels of inflammatory cytokines, of inflammation, by turning down energy and by making you lethargic, by making you apathetic, so you lose motivation, by making you more depressed, by, you know, kind of making you do what you do when you get a severe flu or severe COVID or whatever. You're laying on the couch and you don't feel very good. You don't have energy. You're not in a good mood. You just want to lay there and kind of do nothing. That's basically what sickness behavior is. And so let me explain the adaptive component for it. If in an evolutionary context outside of the modern world, let's say you got a pathogen, you got an infection, or let's say you injured yourself, you fell down, you severely sprained your ankle, or you broke a leg or an arm, or injured your shoulder, or whatever, or you just scraped your body, you've got cuts all over or something like that. You fell down the side of a cliff in Easter Island, for example.
That's a very, very specific example. You might want to mention that actually happened to you while we were on a trip there.
Yeah, I was hoping you'd get that. So the body's response to that, the body senses that there's lots of tissue that's injured in any of those contexts, and so it makes you rest. Mm-hmm. And why does it make you rest? It's similar to kind of what you were talking about before. If you've got a cold, you are going to recover faster from that if you rest, as opposed to if you go do hard exercise. If you go do a bunch of hard exercise every day and crazy workouts, you're going to actually depress your immune function and make it harder for your body to fend that pathogen off.
So I see that all the time in the clinic, where a person gets an illness and then they're like mostly back, like 80 or 85% better, and then they go exercise and they're like, my sickness came back. And I'm like, no, it never went away. You just shuttled energy. Like, you sent a signal to your brain that, hey, I need this energy because I'm running away from a tiger right now. And so your body's like, okay, I'll give you that because that's more immediate. And then they got quote unquote sicker after doing that. They didn't get sicker. Their body's just like, hey, I really need this energy to get you better. So yes, I'm going to slam you and shut you down so that you give me that energy.
Again, yeah, it kind of ties into what we were talking about early in this podcast about appreciating the innate intelligence of the body, understanding how it works and working with it, giving the body what it needs in that moment. So in an ancestral context, this stuff really takes care of itself for the most part. I mean, if you've got an injury, if you've got an infection, you rest, and you know, that's what they do. The problem is, in the modern world, we now have many different sources of chronic inflammation that are ubiquitous and that are not really happening from a pathogen or an injury or something like that. I'll give you a few examples. Sleep deprivation. If you don't sleep enough, you will have higher levels of inflammation, of inflammatory cytokines floating around in your bloodstream, okay, that are signaling to your brain, oh, we're under attack. We have problems in the body that need resources to repair and regenerate and heal. Psychological stress will also cause, especially chronic psychological stress, will cause increased inflammation. Body composition, excess body fat, simply having too much body fat on your body. The fat itself, the actual adipose tissue, produces adipokines, produces low-grade chronic inflammation just by virtue of having that fat on your body. Poor nutrition. So if we're eating crappy food, actually, let me mention one more thing about body composition. I'll also say over 80% of the population has excess body fat.
Yeah.
Over 80%. So, okay, so poor nutrition. If you're eating a standard American diet, or even a third of the way towards a standard American diet, let's say you're eating way better than most Americans, but you're still eating quite a bit of that processed food, you are producing an inflammatory response to many of those food ingredients. Any of those sources of inflammation will trigger some degree of sickness behavior in the brain. It's triggering two things. The mitochondria are turning down energy production. They're sensing they're under attack. And the brain is being triggered into sickness behavior.
Well, it's triggering that downward spiral that you were talking about earlier because of the how those systems are all interconnected.
Yes, exactly. And then, as you mentioned before, that there's that study in people with chronic fatigue syndrome who are in basically a severe state of the mitochondria and the brain shutting down these energy production mechanisms. Part of that is literally a shutting down of the muscles of your body. And it's not that the muscles are physically incapable of firing, because, as you said, that when they put in this study, when they put electrodes on the muscles and stimulated them manually through the electrical inputs direct into the muscles, they work, and they produce as much force as a healthy person. Yeah. But if the person is controlling their own muscles via their nervous system, now it's reduced by 60% to 40% of the force producing, energy producing capacity. So there's many different layers to how the body basically shuts things down, shuts down energy production, and tries to shut down your ability to engage with the world in response to perceiving that it's under attack.
Well, I love the way that you frame that, and it's woven throughout the book of this idea of learning how to work with your body to create a pure and sufficient environment that is non-toxic so that you get that optimal outcome. And that's really, it's kind of like learning how to like shake hands with your body and speak the language that your body speaks. There's a quote that I love in your book here. It's, "You are not fighting some enemy that is your current body. Rather, you are healing the temple that your body represents." And I love that. And I think that the spirit of that statement is woven throughout the book. So we're not attacking body fat as a visual or an aesthetic problem. We're saying, look, this body fat is creating low-level inflammation that is showering your mitochondria with toxicity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's reducing your ability to express health. And I think this book is just teaching people the things that they absolutely need to know as far as what is poisoning my mitochondria and how do I optimize it? The other thing that I love about the book is that you don't set it up as these all or nothing, these black and white strategies. You ease people into it, and you provide these awesome stories about different clients that you've worked with and strategies that have worked for them. And I think people hearing how it worked for somebody else makes them understand, like, hey, this is what I'm aiming for, and this is a viable way to do it. Because so many people just get discouraged when it's all or nothing. They fall off for a day and then they feel like a failure and they immediately revert back to what they were doing before. But the way that you approach it in your book, it gives people the room to try different things and see what works for them, and then kind of use that positive upward spiral to incorporate more behaviors slowly over time.
Yeah, well said. And I'll say something else in this vein, which is this is not a typical sort of diet book that's out there.
Mm-hmm.
Most diet books are kind of coming from the frame of, everybody else has got it wrong. It's not low fat. It's not vegan. It's not paleo. It's not this. It's not that. The real best human diet is so-and-so, and you have to eat this exact way, and here's the good foods and here's the bad foods,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Of how to eat the proper way.
Shocking how much confusion and extreme messages there are in that realm these days.
Yes, and there's huge financial incentives for people to try to be diet gurus in that way and become the next paleo or the next keto or whatever.
Sure.
Because if you do succeed in that and convincing tens of millions of people that you've really discovered the one best human diet and it's some unique approach, you can make a huge amount of money from that. So lots of people are doing that. The downside of that is, number one, most of what you'll find in those books is wrong, is cherry-picked, distorted, misrepresented stuff that is just leaving out large bodies of nutritional science that contradict whatever they're saying. And the end effect is that many people end up just being confused because they're getting so much contradictory health advice. Mm-hmm. Now, what I do in my book is, number one, first of all, there's no specific one-size-fits-all diet. I'm not saying, here's the one best diet. Everybody else has got it wrong. Everybody else is a dummy except for me.
That was actually one of the things that lends a lot of credibility to the book, is that there are multiple ways to make these strategies work. Actually, tons of different ways to make those strategies work. And you provide the research to back that up.
Right. So, look, I've been studying nutrition, as you know, for over 25 years, and you've seen me do a lot of wacky diets over those years. I've tried every, extreme diet that there's been.
Yeah.
And I've learned a lot about nutrition science during that time. And, one thing I can tell you is, everybody who's claiming that there's some one specific diet that's the one best right way to eat is simply wrong, and they're distorting the literature. What I do in the book is different in the sense that it's non-dogmatic. It's not one size fits all. It's definitely not any kind of specific extreme diet. It's really just a set of dozens of different nutrition strategies and specific superfoods and supplements that you can pick and choose which ones to integrate and which ones to leave out, and you can integrate them with any particular dietary pattern that you may be on already. Whether you're eating keto or vegan or Mediterranean or paleo, whatever you're eating, you can integrate these dozens of different simple, easy nutrition strategies, superfoods, supplements into that to help optimize and support your mitochondria and support your hormonal and neurotransmitter health and boost your energy and prevent disease. And so, I really just wanted to focus on a non-dogmatic, non-extreme, non-one-size-fits-all approach to optimizing nutrition.
Well, I think how it comes across is, I'm going to give you some options to create inputs that will in turn create those upward spirals in your life.
Exactly.
And you can use, because it's jam-packed with them, you can use whichever ones work for you. And as you said, you can plug it into any style of eating. So you don't have to make wholesale changes to recognize the benefits of your book and your program. You can just incorporate what works for you. And as you see the changes, incorporate more.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I loved it. And I can't recommend Eat for Energy enough. As I said, the feedback from my patients thus far, gone through 2 cases, has been fantastic. And I hope everyone that's watching will go out and buy a copy of Eat for Energy. I want to thank you so much for coming on and making the time. I know surfing keeps you pretty busy nowadays. Not to mention a house full of dogs and 2 kids and all the glory of living deep in the jungle of Central America.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
thank you so much for being here, man. I really appreciate it. And I'll look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks here.
Yes, I will be there, and we'll be surfing and hanging out together and working out together, just like old times. Yeah, thank you so much, Yoni. Always a pleasure, of course, to hang out with you. Any excuse we can have to just hang out and have a fun conversation. And if we get to throw it up on YouTube, and if it sells some books too, then that's a nice added bonus to us hanging out.
So the official release date is May the 10th.
Yes.
May the 10th, everyone. Eat for Energy. My brother, Ari Whitten, he knocked it out of the park. Go out and pick it up. To get a sneak peek of what you can expect from my brother's new book, Eat for Energy, click the link here and he's going to give you a short presentation with practical strategies for boosting your energy through the roof that you can begin implementing today. Thanks so much for watching. I really hope that you enjoyed this video and that you'll put the information to good use. To pick up your copy of Eat for Energy, you can click the link here or the one in the description down below. I'm also going to put down there links for a couple of the studies that my brother referenced in our conversation, so be sure to check those out. But before you head over, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so that you're updated every time a new video comes out. That's all for now. See you next time.